excuse me while I just make sure that everything's working. One, two, three. All right, so we hope that that's all working. Good morning, afternoon, good evening, whenever you happen to be watching this video. So we're leaving the world of animals behind us, and we're going to move on to discuss plants and some of their biology. Again, this is no more than a survey, really, because we could teach a whole year and still not get through half of what we could learn about plants. So it behooves us to remember that on our planet, if all animals were to disappear, the plants would quite happily adapt quite rapidly to our absence. But if all plants were to disappear from the planet, animals would be completely unable to adapt. The biosphere would grind to a halt because plants do many things for us, but the most important thing is the plants are autotrophs. That is, they take carbon dioxide and water, simple, abundant molecules. They combine those using the sun's energy in the process of photosynthesis to create complex biological molecules, which virtually everything else depends on the planet. And that process of photosynthesis radically reformed the entire biosphere, in addition, by pumping it full of oxygen. And not only that, plants originated in aquatic habitats, but they came to colonize land. And when they colonized land, they extensively modified it and made it much more suitable for colonization by animals. So our evolution is intimately connected to the evolution of plants and to the things that they have done to the planet, how they have in fact changed the structure and the functioning of the biosphere. So first of all, we're going to discuss a little bit about how plants actually moved up onto land, because that's a whole story in itself. Then we'll later on, later classes, we'll talk about some of the structure of plants and their functioning, and then something about their reproduction as well. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about how plants actually moved up onto land. They evolved in aquatic habitats, and for about 3 billion years of the Earth's history at the start, the terrestrial surface was completely lifeless, except for groups of photosynthetic bacteria, the cyanobacteria, which moved onto land about 1.2 billion years ago. They certainly had an effect on the ecology. They had the cyanobacteria were the first organisms to evolve the system of photosynthesis, and they changed the atmospheric structure by pumping oxygen into the atmosphere and creating aerobic environments. But it was only about 500 million years ago that the first small plants emerged onto land, and following those plants, as they modified the environment, for other organisms like fungi and animals also began to follow them. So we need to understand a little bit about the evolution of plants themselves. And from 500 million years ago till now, the evolution of plants has led to the development of approximately 290,000 living species of plant. And a plant is defined as a multicellular photosynthetic organism. And we exclude from that definition those simpler multicellular organisms, the algae, things like that, which are protists. The plants not only can contribute oxygen, they are the food source, they are the basis of the feeding structures of all communities on land and in aquatic systems. They have another function, which of course we have particular interest in at the moment, and that is in the process of photosynthesis. They're dragging carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and they're building it into complex biological molecules. Some of the molecules which plants create from that carbon dioxide are extremely long-lived. So plants act as a carbon sink. It's not a permanent sink. Ultimately, those compounds will be degraded, most of them, but they are degraded over a very long period of time. So plants can actually act as a carbon sink, which is why we are particularly interested in them now that we realize that global heating is becoming such a problem. Okay, so the first plants to emerge onto land were very simple, very small, and from them evolved a whole series of other plants up till the modern day plants that we see today. Now, if we look at this forest scene in this picture here, we can see all of them in actual fact. Here on this log is encrusted with simple plants. These are the mosses and another group of plants you may not have heard of called the liverworts. Mosses are probably familiar to you. The mosses, the liverworts, all of these, they're photosynthetic. They're very distinctly land plants, but they are small, and they are small for a reason that we'll explain in a minute. They share ancestry with these plants here, which are much larger. These are the ferns. They actually, there are a large number of allied groups to the ferns, share common characteristics with the ferns. They're called the Terraphytes. Behind them here, growing in this forest, these are plants which are seed plants. The ferns and these trees and all of the familiar plants to us, these are vascular plants. They have an extensive vasculature inside, conducting vessels which conduct water and photosynthetic products throughout the plant. But the ferns here have no seeds. The evolution of the seed was a major advance in plant evolution because it allowed plants to penetrate far onto land. The ferns and the mosses still remain tied to water. They have to at least periodically be inundated with water. The seed plants do not. They are obviously dependent on water. They need water. But they can obtain their water from extensive root systems, and they produce a seed which is resistant to desiccation. So it can be spread far away. It can rest until conditions are suitable for growth. So here, just in this picture, we see basically all of plant evolution laid out for us. We'll go through each of those steps again, so don't panic. We can tie the plants, the land plants, very solidly to the protists, to the algae. And the algae and the land plants definitely share ancestry. There is one group of algae in particular which we are interested in. And these are the algae called the Carophytes, because we regard them as being the closest relatives to the land plants. In other words, the Carophytes and land plants share a relatively recent common ancestor. And the land plants share characteristics with the Carophytes, which they don't share with any other algae. Carophytes are very definitely algae. They are protists, but they share the following characteristics with the land plants. First of all, they have a very distinctive method, which we won't go into the details, but they have a distinctive method of synthesizing cellulose. The second thing is land plants actually have flagellated sperm. And in particular, this is easy to see in the more primitive land plants like the ferns and the mosses and these things. If we look at the sperm, we find that the structure of the sperm is very similar to that of the Carophytes. But we, in recent times, also discovered that there are extensive similarities in DNA sequence, in particular nuclear DNA, but also the DNA. Remember that the chloroplasts and the mitochondria all have their own DNA. And all of those in the Carophytes and the land plants share distinct similarities. So they're obviously very closely related. They share a relatively common ancestor. There's one other thing, and that is something that distinguishes the Carophytes from most other algae is that they actually produce something very similar to a spore. And that is a reproductive unit which has a coat around it, which can be dispersed and found in new plants. The spores, these spores actually have some other characteristics which will become apparent in a while. But the one thing to realize is that land plants also produce spores. And both Carophytes and the land plants have in that spore wall, they have this substance, sporopollenin. And sporopollenin is a compound which is unique to the Carophytes and to the land plants. And it's a very strong tie between the two of them. So these are Carophytes. This one is called Cara. There are several genera. There's another one, common one called Nitella. And here you can see these little reproductive bodies on these. They're not true leaves, they're actually branches. But you can see them here. This is another one here. It's called Coleochaete, sorry. And it's also a Carophyte. It's quite remarkable to think that these are relatives, probably relatives of the land plant. But there are all of these characteristics which tie them to the land plants. All of these arose from an ancestral alga. And that ancestral alga gave rise to these particular groups. The first are the red algae, which are quite distinct and regarded as being relatively primitive. The second group are called the Chlorophytes, and the Chlorophytes are very closely related to the Carophytes. In fact, the Carophytes used to be regarded, before we looked at their DNA, they used to be included in the Chlorophytes. They have been put into their own group, and they form a clade together with all of the other plants. All of the other plants are called the embryophytes for a reason that I'll show you in a minute. There's a very distinct reason why they are called the embryophytes. So Carophytes and embryophytes share a common ancestor. And they share that group, that clade, forms a clade together with the Chlorophytes. They share a common ancestor. And there's a common ancestral alga to all of them. So we have to think about why it is, what was the impetus for moving onto land? What advantage did moving onto land provide? We're going to assume that the first plants to move onto land were relatively primitive plants. What advantage was there to moving onto land? In fact, what were the disadvantages that they had to overcome? The first thing is there was no predators, there were no herbivores or anything to eat them up on land. That was a huge advantage. The second thing was the carbon dioxide was much more readily available and much more accessible in open air. So carbon dioxide is essential for photosynthesis. The third thing is, of course, there was nothing essentially to utilize the minerals and everything in the soil. So the soil was extremely rich, not with organic matter. There was some organic matter from the bacteria which had inhabited it, but it was mineral rich, where aquatic environments tend to be mineral poor. So there were huge advantages to moving up onto land. but it also presented challenges. The first is, when you move up onto land, you are liable to be dried out, to be dehydrated. So the first occupation of land was limited to areas which were relatively close to the water until systems for resisting dehydration evolved. There are many mosses, for example, which occur in very dry areas, but they survive by becoming inactive when they dry out and then very rapidly reanimating when water falls on them. That is an adaptation which arose afterwards, after they had moved up onto land. A much more important limitation, though, on land is that in water, you are essentially weightless. You're entirely supported by the water, by buoyancy in the water. Move up onto land, and you have to resist the forces of gravity. You can just imagine. You've seen it at the beach, when algae, which underwater are beautiful big floating plants and extend through the water column, bring them up onto land, they simply collapse under the force of gravity. This is a great disadvantage, and it limited the early plants on land to small size because they had no support structures, very limited support structure. I wouldn't say no support structure, but very limited support structures. So that's the first thing. Now, the characteristics of land plants, there are certain characteristics which they all have in common. Some of them they share with their ancestral algal, with their algal ancestors, rather. The first is all plants alternate between two multicellular stages. They have two reproductive stages, and they alternate between the two. This is called alternation of generations. And the first kind of plant is called the Gametophyte, and the Gametophyte produces the gametes. But the Gametophyte is haploid. It is N. It has half the number of chromosomes, and it produces its gametes by mitosis. So somewhere along the line in the development of the Gametophyte, the chromosome number was halved. Then the whole plant only has half number. And then it divides by mitosis to produce spores, to produce gametes, rather. And those gametes are haploid. Those gametes get together, they fertilize one another, and they give rise to a diploid sporophyte. The sporophyte is this plant which is diploid, it is 2N, and it has some part of it undergoes meiosis to produce spores. And those spores are haploid, they are N, and they produce the gametes, the gametophytes. So we'll have a look here, and you'll see this is typical for primitive plants. First of all, we'll start off here with this is the sporophyte. In ferns and those kind of things, what you see is the sporophyte, okay? And somewhere on the fern plant, there's an area with reproductive cells. And those cells divide by meiosis. And they produce spores, hence the name sporophyte. They produce spores. And those spores are haploid, N. They go on to form gametophytes, entirely separate plants. And those gametophytes produce male and female gametes by mitosis. Those gametes get together, they fertilize one another, form a 2N diploid zygote, which goes on to form the new sporophyte. So what is happening? We are alternating between a haploid generation and a diploid generation. Haploid, diploid. Now, the land plants all show this. It becomes highly modified in the more advanced plants, but they all show, to some degree or another, this alternation of generations. But this is also characteristic of the algae. The algae also have very complex life cycles, but the fundamental structure is an alternation of generations like this. I told you also that the land plants are all known as embryophytes. And the reason that they're called embryophytes is because the egg in the female part is embedded in the tissue of the parent plant and is fertilized inside the tissue. And the embryo actually grows as almost like in a parasitic fashion. So this tissue around here is gametophyte tissue. And it has produced eggs, which have been an egg which has been fertilized here to form an embryo. Here's the maternal tissues around here of the gametophyte, and here is now the sporophyte, the sporophyte embryo, growing almost as a parasite inside the female tissue. So that retention of the diploid embryo, that is what gives land plants their name, the embryophytes. And this was a major advance. In aquatic systems, gametes can simply be liberated into the water, and there can be external fertilization. But with land plants, they require some adaptations for reproduction to take place. And one major advance in reproductive strategies was to enclose the eggs in maternal tissue so that they were fertilized and maintained in a safe, nutrient-rich, and well-hydrated environment until they were big enough to become relatively independent. Okay, so here is a typical early primitive plant. This is, you can find these widely growing on stream margins or in the forests or anywhere where it is relatively damp. And these are typical primitive plants. These are mosses. They belong to a group called the Bryophyta. So in the Bryophyta, if we go, this is the characteristic of the very early primitive plants. In the Bryophyta, in fact, it is this stage here. It is the gametophyte, the haploid stage, which is the dominant phase. That is a long-lived phase in the mosses and their allies. And here it is. This here is the gametophyte. There, all of these green leafy-looking parts, that is gametophyte, and it is haploid. And it produces gametes, which this gametophyte holds. The female produces eggs, which she holds here at the cap here. There is a separate male plant which produces sperm. And those sperm, here is a major limitation for these small primitive plants. Those sperm are flagellated and they have to swim. They have to swim to the egg to fertilize it. So these plants require water for fertilization. So they are somewhat limited by that constraint. The eggs are fertilized by a sperm and they form a new plant, an entirely new, even though in this case it is parasitic on the gametophyte. Here it is here, and this is the sporophyte. And the area where it produces spores by meiosis is called the sporangium. It's this area here. It's enclosed here in a wall initially. And inside you can see here a mass of haploid spores. Some of those spores will go on to form female gametophytes. Some of them will go on to form male gametophytes. In some cases, a spore can produce a plant which is both male and female, but very often they are separate. Here's the important thing to realize. This whole plant here, there, is diploid, 2N. This plant here is haploid, end. But here in this region of the sporophyte, meiosis takes place to produce these spores here, which will then be liberated. The spores are often liberated so they can actually blow away or be washed away to go somewhere else, to find somewhere suitable to settle and form a new colony of gametophytes. The gametophytes in the mosses can be very long-lived. They can last year to year to year. But the sporophytes are relatively short-lived. Once they produce the spores, that's it. The sporophyte dies. But the gametophyte carries on living. This is a very typical moss. This is a moss called sphagnum. And that is very commonly encountered. So there is a little bit of anatomy to learn. The areas where the gametes are produced are usually highly specialized. And they are produced within specialized organs or specialized areas of the plant called the gametangia. So the gametangia are the areas where the gametes are going to be produced. The female gametangia are called the archegonia. And they produce eggs, and they are the site of fertilization because remember, these are embryophytes. They hold the egg for fertilization. The male gametangia are called the Antheridia, and they produce and release flagellated motile sperm. But the sperm has to swim to the archegonium in order to fertilize the egg. So here, this is another group very closely allied to the mosses. You can also find these very easily if you go Brooklyn Botanic Gardens or Prospect Park or wherever, and you look in damp areas in the forest or next to a stream bed or something like that. These are the liverworts. And this is the actual plants growing here. Here's a separate male plant here. And behind here, a little bit out of focus, this is a female plant here. But these produce special gametangia, which are raised up on stalks. And here, this is the female here, star-like. And this is the male here, which is more disc-like. And if you look on the underneath of this here, you'll see each of these here, each of these little things that are shaped like a vase with an egg in it. Each of these is an archegonium, plural archegonia. And the Antheridia, here's the male here, and here are the Antheridia here. Again, producing gametes by mitosis. So the archegonium here produces an egg by mitosis. Why? Because this whole plant is haploid. Same here. The haploid plant producing sperm by mitosis. When this plant is inundated with water, when it's covered with water, the Antheridia will open to release sperm. And the sperm are actually attracted to the archegonia. There are actually pheromones, there are chemicals which are released, which allow the sperm to track their path to the archegonia to fertilize the egg. But the plants there has to be at least a film of water covering the underneath of the female gametangia and the surface of the male gametangia for fertilization to occur. That's a big disadvantage. And it's remained a disadvantage to land plants for many millions of years. Now, at the moment, I'm just discussing some of the characteristics of land plants. We'll talk more about evolution in a minute. So the next characteristic of plants, land plants that we need to understand, is there is a division in the land plants between the small primitive plants like the mosses and the liverworts and more advanced land plants like the ferns, and then like the gymnosperms, the pine trees, and then the flowering plants, etc. And that is that the mosses and liverworts do not have any vasculature. They do not have little tubes running through them to conduct water or to conduct photosynthetic materials efficiently throughout the whole plant. There was a huge advance in evolution of plants when plants developed this vasculature. And these vascular plants have another characteristic, and that is that they grow from their tips. So this is called apical growth, and it occurs because there is a set of cells at the ends of branches which are like stem cells. They continually reproduce, and the cells that they produce move backwards effectively because these apical stem cells move forward as they divide. As that forward movement of the stem cells occurs, the cells behind begin to differentiate, and they differentiate into all of the tissues of the plant. So growth is from the apices of the branches. The same thing happens at the roots. So here, the stem cell area is called the meristem. It is rapidly dividing undifferentiated tissue. But as the apical meristem moves forward because it's dividing, the cells left behind begin to differentiate. They differentiate into all of the vascular tissues of the plant, and they develop into things like the leaves, and they may in fact even develop into side branches off the side. The same thing is happening at the roots. The roots are also developing from their tips and growing downwards. So there's a little problem for you to solve. If you were to carve your initials into a tree, and they're at a certain height, 6 feet, and then you return in 20 years' time, and the tree has grown 20 foot, how high above the ground are the initials that you carve? Well, what have I just told you? I've told you that they grow from the tips. They don't grow from down here. They grow from the tips. So that should make the answer obvious to you. Okay, so land plants also have some other characteristics which they all share. The first is they have to have adaptations to resist drying out. And one of the most important is that they cover the outside of the plant with a cuticle. It's a waxy covering produced by the epidermis, and that reduces evaporation. It's a specific adaptation to the fact that being on land places the plant at risk of drying out. The second thing is much less obvious, and that is that most plants have very, very close association with soil-dwelling fungi, and these are called the mycorrhizae. The mycorrhizae, in fact, wrap around the roots, for example, and form a very intimate association. And they are important for the transfer of water into the roots and also for the transfer of mineral substances. And they may also produce, the mycorrhizae may also produce growth factors, antibiotics, and all sorts of other things which protect the roots. It is a very intimate association. And although they can be separated from one another very often and grown separately, they do not do nearly as well as when the two are placed together. And there are specific mycorrhizal associations with specific plants. Many of the mushrooms that you see growing are actually the fruiting bodies of mycorrhizal fungi deep underground, associated with the roots of trees. And this is a characteristic of land plants that does not occur in the algae. So when we look at the evolution of the plants and their movement up onto land, it is, when we look at the fossil record, we find about 475 million years ago, we find fossils of spores and of sporophyte tissue in sediments which were made on land, which were made up on land. So we know that by 475 million years ago, let me just flip back here, something like this, there was something on land which was undergoing this kind of life cycle. And we clearly see this in the fossil record. There are spores, fossilized spores, and even fossilized sporophyte tissue. So there's something on land 475 million years ago, a primitive plants, probably, which had these already had these characteristics. So those ancestral plants gave rise to all of the plants on land plants that we see today. So their origin is here. It's around about 475 million years ago. We believe that we see reflections of those early plants in this group, the mosses, liverworts, and the hornworts. These are plants which have no vasculature. So they are relatively small. They can be extremely abundant, and the Gametophyte here is the dominant plant form. The Sporophytes are always parasitic on the Gametophyte. So we are very unsure. The reason that this is a dotted line, we are very unsure about the relationship of these to one another and to the rest of the land plants, but we are pretty sure that they share some common ancestry, and that the character of the primitive ancestor is reflected in these plants. At about 425 million years ago, plants began to develop vasculature. The vasculature systems began to evolve. So those initial plants that had a vasculature but did not produce seeds are called the seedless vascular plants. And they are groups you may not know of. Lycophytes, one group. I'll show you a picture, but it's more important for you to remember these, which are the Terraphytes, which are the ferns, which are probably familiar to you, and some of their relatives. So this whole group here, the Lycophytes and the Terraphytes, they are vascular plants, but they don't have seeds. So they are seedless vascular plants. The vasculature was really important for all sorts of reasons that I'll explain in a minute. It was a huge evolutionary advance, and it allowed plants to begin to move inland much more than they had before. And it allowed them also to grow in height. And this is how they began to move inland. They began to modify land as they moved. The next major advance in the plants was that vascular plants developed seeds. And we'll talk about what is the characteristic of a seed in a while. So these are the groups that we're going to talk about. The land plants, we believe, 475 million years ago, probably started way before, but here's where we have our first fossils. The next evolutionary advance was the development of vasculature. And these are all vascular plants. All of the ferns and their allies, then the gymnosperms, which are the pines, things like that, and the angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. These are all vascular plants. But the ferns and their allies are seedless. These, the pines and the flowering plants, these are seed plants. And they arose about 305, probably actually a bit earlier, but they do share a common ancestry, the two of them, and it lies somewhere around here, 300 million years ago. Okay, so here they are here. I'll just show you a couple of examples. So first, we've had a good look at the mosses already. So here are our first vascular plants, the first plants to have a true system for conducting, first of all, for conducting water throughout the plant, from roots to the very tips of the plant. And second of all, for conveying the products of photosynthesis throughout the plant. Remember that the roots have to be fed by products of photosynthesis, for example. So the products of photosynthesis need to be distributed throughout the plant. And here are the most important of the groups. The Lycophytes that you may not know of here. And these are the much more familiar to you. These are the Terraphytes. And the Terraphytes are not only the ferns, but there are some allied plants as well. These are this is what a seed is. Now, these plants are all vascular, but they have no seed. These plants, the seed plants, produce a seed, which is a very distinctive feature. A seed is an embryo. It's a plant embryo. It's the result of fertilization, of union of gametes to form first a zygote. The zygote grows to a certain stage to form an embryo, which often then kind of goes dormant. The embryo in a seed is usually surrounded by some nutrient source, some nutrient store. And most characteristic of all, it is surrounded by a protective coat. And that coat protects it not only from predators, it protects it from harsh conditions like drying out. And the seed, it varies from plant to plant. But seeds usually have a certain period of where they can remain dormant. It gives them time to be transported to a suitable area where conditions will allow them to grow. And when suitable conditions arise, the embryo reactivates and the seed germinates to form a new plant. So there are two groups of seed plants, two groups of seed plants, and these are the Gymnosperms. Gymnosperm means naked seed. And the reason for that is that the seed coat is not produced by the ovary, by an ovary. You'll see later on in later classes exactly what this means. In the angiosperms, the seed is protected by various elaborations of the plant, the area of the plant where the egg was produced. And it's a more advanced seed form. So they are very closely allied by ancestry, but their reproduction is somewhat different to one another. But they do form a clade. So here's the typical Gymnosperm seeds. And if you'll find out later in a later class that this seed is simply covered by the outside of the ovule, which is the unit, the reproductive unit. These are seeds of flowering plants. And in these, there is some elaboration. There is an area of the plant called the ovary, which holds the egg in the seed plants. And the ovary actually becomes elaborated to enclose the embryo in complex ways with a coat around the outside, which can be formed from various parts of the plant and especially of the ovary to form the seed. So the seed in the flowering plants is more complex than it is in the Gymnosperms. Remember these names, the Gymnosperms, the angiosperms. Start to memorize these names. Okay, so here's another major difference between the different groups of plants. The first is in the non-vascular plants, like the mosses and the liverworts. As I've told you, the gametophyte is long-lived. Here it is here. This leafy part here is the gametophyte, and the sporophyte is actually parasitic on it and is short-lived. Remember, the gametophyte here is N. It is haploid. The sporophyte here is diploid, but it undergoes meiosis here in these areas here to produce the spores. These are called the sporangia there. So the gametophyte is haploid, sporophyte is diploid. Here's a typical life cycle for one of the mosses or one of their allies. We'll start off here with the sporophyte. Here's the sporophyte. Here's the, I'm wrapping around the wrong thing. Here's the sporophyte here. Here are the gametophytes. The gametophytes are haploid, and they are producing gametes, female. This is a female plant which has produced an egg here, which has been fertilized to produce a sporophyte. The sporophyte undergoes meiosis and produces spores, and those spores form separate plants which are going to form the gametophytes. Here is the gametophyte here. Here is a female gametophyte growing. Here is a male gametophyte growing. They are N because the spores which produce them are N. Each of these plants here produces its relevant gametes. Here is a male plant producing the flagellated sperm from its Antheridia. Here is the female producing eggs in the archegonia. When they are covered with water, the sperm can swim to the egg in the archegonium, fertilize, forms a zygote, and the zygote forms an embryo which grows to be the sporophyte. And the sporophyte is diploid. It is diploid because these gametes, which were N, united to form a 2N or diploid zygote. Here it is here. Here is a gametophyte here. This was a female gametophyte that produced eggs, and now the sporophyte is growing parasitically on it there. So this is a typical alternation of generations, a haploid generation and a diploid generation. And typical for the most primitive plants, the gametophyte is the dominant. So here it is here again. This is another moss called Polytrichum, also very, very common. And you can see the sporophytes here growing on the gametophyte. Okay, that system here in the very primitive plants becomes modified as we proceed now to look at the vascular plants and then at the flowering, at the seed producing vascular plants. We'll see that this alternation of generations becomes much modified. This is the most primitive condition. Now, the important thing also to note is that the vascular plants, first starting with groups like the ferns and their allies, that vasculature provided huge advantages to the plant. Not only did it efficiently conduct water up and throughout the plant from the roots, but it also conducted photosynthetic products efficiently throughout the whole plant. Another characteristic of these plants is that they have true roots. They have roots which extend through the substrate, not only to anchor the plant, but also to absorb water and to absorb minerals. And that gets distributed by the vasculature. The bryophytes and their plants like that do not have that system. They don't even have true roots. They have little anchoring elements, but they are not true roots. They don't absorb water the way that a true root does. But vascular tissue, the vascular plants began to diversify about 425 million years ago. The vascular tissue confers another great advantage, and that is that it produces strength. It produces a rigid, skeleton-like structure inside the plant. First of all, even in a young plant or in a soft plant, the vasculature, when it's filled with fluid, the fluid is incompressible in the plants. Okay, the fluid permeates these tubes throughout, and it acts like a hydrostatic skeleton. It is a skeleton made of water, which allows the plant to resist the force of gravity. Now, you've all seen this. You have a house plant, but you forget to water. As the water evaporates from the plant, as the water is lost from the plant begins to wilt. And that is because that pressure inside the tubes is lessened and the strength of the plant is lost. Now, in other plants, in older plants especially, in plants which last a long time, additional strengthening is provided to the vasculature. And you just think of something like a tree. The wood of a tree is all an elaboration of its vasculature. It's the tubes which conducted water especially become strengthened. And that is specifically to provide the plant with strength against the force of gravity. So now the vascular plants can begin to grow tall. They can lift their photosynthetic organs, the leaves, high above other plants, for example, and they begin to compete with one another, of course, to get into the optimum light for photosynthesis to take place. But the ferns and their allies are still limited because they still produce flagellated sperm, which need to swim to the ovum, to the egg in the female. So that is a huge limitation. So there is an evolutionary response to this, and which we'll see in a minute. So here, for example, this is just a picture of the vasculature, a part of the vasculature, sorry, of a fern. And here in the center here are the vessels which conduct water primarily from the direction of roots up through the whole plant. And they are carrying water and minerals, etc., throughout the whole plant. This is called xylem tissue. And xylem tissue very frequently is strengthened by other biomolecules, especially a molecule called lignin. And lignin is a lignified xylem tissue is actually what makes up wood. But here in the more primitive vascular plants, here it is here in a little bundle here, and surrounding it here is the tissue which conducts the photosynthetic products throughout the plant, and this is called phloem. Xylem tissue is usually dead. It usually is not long-lived, but it persists because it is strengthened by these other products like lignin. It persists as a rigid tube throughout the plant to continue to provide conduction and to provide strength. The phloem is usually shorter-lived and is regularly replaced. So the living vascular plants, ferns on up to the flowering plants, they have a characteristic that in fact the sporophyte is the dominant. The gametophyte is now going to be reduced. And this, in the ferns, this is a direct response to the requirement that sperm swim to the egg. Have a look at the plant itself, and you'll realize the plant here is big. If this was gametophyte, it would have to get sperm to fall from leaves or whatever to the ground, somehow get down there and swim to an egg. It's almost impossible. It would be extremely limiting on the size of the organism. But these are vascular plants and they grow tall. So what has happened is that the life cycle has adapted, and now the sporophyte is the dominant. So here's the Fern Sporophyte. Somewhere on the Fern Sporophyte, there is an area where meiosis is taking place. Here it is on this particular fern, it's on the underside of the leaf. These are called the sori, S-O-R-I. And there are areas where the sporophyte plant is producing spores. And the spores are produced here. This here is a sporangium. It's an individual little organ, that is where the cells are undergoing meiosis to produce haploid spores. And those spores are going to go off and they are going to found gametophytes. They're going to found separate gametophyte plants. And those gametophyte plants, in fact, are very small. They're quite short-lived, and they are usually on or lightly buried in the ground so that they are easily flooded with water. And the gametes that they produce are easily fertilized. So here's what a fern life cycle looks like. In the fern life cycle, the sporophyte is the dominant plant. It is diploid. And somewhere on that sporophyte, there is an area where there are sporangia, which are undergoing meiosis, which produce spores. And the spores are dispersed. And they germinate in areas which are usually damp and liable to be flooded. Yeah, even with a light rain or whatever. Sometimes even with a drop of water. Here, for example, this is a gametophyte for a fern, usually no more than a centimeter or so in diameter, obscure, relatively short-lived, but they have areas where they produce archegonia, and male, if separate gametophyte, areas where they produce sperm in Antheridia. And just as we saw before, they get flooded, the sperm are released, and they swim to the archegonium and fertilize it. Now, the sporophyte is again parasitic on the gametophyte, but the gametophyte dies. And instead, the sporophyte is long-lived. In the case of many of these plants, extremely long-lived. And the sporophyte now, 2N, diploid, is the dominant form. And those are the ferns that we see around. Turn fern leaves over, and you can very often easily see the sorus or the sori. Remember, the underneath of a leaf is a site for sori. You never laugh at my jokes anyway, but it's a way to remember. So this vasculature developed in all of the vascular plants, the ferns, and then gymnosperms and the flowering plants, allows these plants to become tall, to get away from the soil surface, lift up above other plants, and be exposed to optimum light. Here are this group of the ferns and their allies. Here's a typical fern. This is one you may also have seen and not necessarily realize what you were looking at. This is called equisetum, and equisetum is also called club moss. There's sometimes, but it's nothing to do with the mosses. It's also called a horsetail because many of them have these branches coming off the side, which makes it look like a horse's tail. And they actually produce these are the sporophytes. So they are producing spores, and they produce these ones in particular. The horsetail produce their spores in a special organ called the strobilus. This is another one. You may see this, have seen this. This is called Xylotum. It's called a whisk fern. All of these are allied, vascular, non-seed producing plants, and they're in a group called the Terraphyte. The Terraphyte used to be the dominant plant form on land. So especially around that time, around 300, 400 million years ago, in the Carboniferous, they were the dominant plant form, and they formed tall plants, tree forms. These would be 15, 20 foot high or so. And these are, remember, are closely allied to current living plants. But these giant forests of Terraphytes have become extinct. They were so abundant that they actually formed huge beds of fossilized organic material, and those are current day coal beds. So the coal beds are largely the remains of these terraphyte forests that occurred. They were somewhat limited to marshy and damp areas, again, because their gametophytes had to survive and be fertilized. But nonetheless, these also began to modify the land habitat extensively. And they made the land habitat extremely suitable for the movement onto land of other animals. Initially, things like the arthropods, and then later on, the vertebrates as well. So they extensively modified land as they began to colonize it. So these are vascular non-seed producing plants. They it's very difficult to say exactly what their relationship is to the vascular seed producing plants. There is one slight hint, and that is that towards the end of the Carboniferous, a group of plants arose, of these fern-like plants, which actually seem to have produced a true seed. And these are called the seed ferns. What their exact relationship to the vascular seed plants is in modern times is not known. But it is a hint, at least, that they may share, that the vascular seed producing plants may share an ancestry with the things like the ferns and those sorts of things. Okay, so next time we're going to proceed to talk more about the seed plants, the vascular seed plants, and how their life cycle, although it still entails an alternation of generations, how it has become extensively modified. Okay, so I'll leave you there, and I will see you tomorrow, Wednesday. Please make sure that you've completed viewing this before we proceed tomorrow. Thank you.